Okay, one of the most frustrating things that happens when baking a cake is when you go to have a little taste test once it's done and it's not quite the soft, moist cake you were hoping for. Instead, it's a bit dry and crumbly. But you know what? This has happened to me so many times while recipe testing, so don't worry, you are not alone. Thankfully though, there's usually a decent explanation as to why you've ended up with a dry cake. So today I'm going to be sharing 5 reasons why you might end up with a dry cake so that you can go ahead and make some adjustments next time you go to bake. So the first reason is that you've used a different sized cake pan and you haven't accounted for any changes in cooking time. So say for example your recipe calls for 8-inch cake tins, which is what most of my recipes use. However, you only have 10-inch cake tins and so you decide to go ahead and use those. Well, what that means is that your cake layers are going to be thinner because the same amount of batter is going to spread out more in a larger cake tin. What this means though is that you're going to need to reduce the cooking time because the batter is, spread out thinner in the cake tin. If you don't reduce the cooking time, then your cake is going to overbake and it's going to end up dry. And literally just a few extra minutes of baking can do this to your cake. Now this leads on to my second reason, which is using a cake tin which is a different material or color. Now these cake pans here, which I usually use, are light in color compared to this pan here, which is darker in color. Now this darker colored pan is going to absorb heat quicker than this light colored pan, which means that my darker colored pan is going to cook my cake slightly faster than my light colored pan. So again, you want to reduce the cooking time and check the cake a little bit earlier when using a dark colored pan if in the original recipe they used a light colored pan to bake their cake. The same thing applies when using metal baking tins compared to glass baking dishes. So metal absorbs and retains heat better than glass baking dishes, so your cakes are going to cook faster in metal pans compared to glass ones. The third reason why you might end up with a dry cake is that incorrect measurements were used. Now I know I sound like a broken record when it comes to this one. I feel like I've mentioned it so many times in my videos, but I honestly cannot express the importance of properly measuring your ingredients, especially your dry ingredients. If you have too much flour in a recipe and not enough fat like butter or oil, then your cake is going to be dry and on the harder side. For best results, I highly encourage you to use a scale when baking, but if you don't have a scale, then just make sure you're using measuring cups correctly, especially when measuring out your dry ingredients. The fourth reason is that your oven temperature is just a tad too high and you've unfortunately overbaked your cake. Now, I have spoken about the difference between convection and conventional ovens in a previous video, which I'll post a link to down below, but here is the main thing that you need to know. If your recipe calls for you to preheat your oven to say 180°C or 350°F in a conventional oven which doesn't have a fan function, then if you do decide to use a fan function because you have one, then you will need to reduce the oven temperature by about 15 to 20 degrees Celsius. Otherwise, you're going to overbake your cake. This is because convection ovens, which do have a fan function, bake cakes faster than those that don't. So if you are someone who likes to use the fan function, then just remember to reduce the temperature. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a dry and hard cake. Now, the last reason why you might end up with a dry or hard cake is that incorrect substitutions or reductions were made, and so you end up with, a cake that's not so moist. Now, just to give you a bit of an idea of what I mean, here are some examples. So first is that you've substituted oil with butter. Now, the reality is that oil is liquid at room temperature and it also has more fat than butter. And so if you substitute all of the oil in a recipe with butter, you're going to end up with a less moist cake. Another example is substituting plain all-purpose flour with whole wheat or wholemeal flour. Whole wheat flour is more coarse and soaks up more liquid than all-purpose flour, so you're going to end up with a drier cake. Another one is reducing the sugar in a recipe. So sugar is actually considered a wet ingredient in cake batter, so if you reduce the amount of sugar, you're going to end up with a less moist cake. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't make the substitutions above, but what I am saying is that if you understand the impacts that these substitutions have on your cake batter, then you can make some, other adjustments in your cake batter to ensure that you still have a nice moist cake. So for example, if you decide to use whole wheat flour instead of all-purpose flour, then you might add a little bit more liquid into your cake batter so that you don't end up with a dry cake. So that is it for today, guys. I hope this video helped you better understand why you might end up with a dry cake sometimes. For, more baking tips and tricks to help you become a better baker, check out this video here, and I'll see you next week with a new recipe.